Welcome to the Solar Energy Channel, where you'll get an honest inside look at all things solar. In the solar industry, it seems like there's so much breaking news lately that it gives us great content to talk about and how it's impacting our industry. Today with me, I have our CEO, Dale Good, who's going to help us discuss two events that are breaking over the last couple of weeks, one of which is the Commerce announcement on the anti-dumping and the tariffs related to Southeastern Asia, and as well as the IRA guidelines that were recently announced, preliminary guidelines by the United States Treasury Department. And so, Dale, welcome. Good to have you again.
Good to be here, Warren.
So let's talk about, first of all, this article that was put out last week by Solar Power World, where they talk about the Commerce suggests that anti-dumping tariffs to be extended to solar cell and panel imports from Southeast Asia, and that there are, in fact, companies in that region that are circumventing the tariffs, and they've moved manufacturing to those areas to get around paying those tariffs.
Yeah, so I can't say I'm really surprised by this, but there was 4 countries involved: Cambodia, Thailand, Vietnam, and Malaysia. I believe were the 4 countries. And we knew a lot of modules are coming out of those countries. And if they were going to find anything there that they're circumventing, we're probably going to get hit with a tariff. And it sure looks like that's where they're going with the preliminary findings. It's going to be a while until the final findings don't come out until the spring of 2023. And because President Biden put a 2-year delay on any tariffs, they wouldn't go into effect until, I think it's June 6th of 2024. So there is a window of time here where there wouldn't be any new tariffs per se, but I'm not surprised by the findings.
Do you know, Dale, I remember reading previously that the tariffs prior to this announcement were potentially going to be retroactive. Do you know, are some of these companies at risk for that still being retroactive, or has the retroactive piece been taken off the table?
No, the delay that President Biden gave eliminated that risk.
Okay.
So that was the key. So I don't see that as being a risk. And, it should be noted, Warren, there have been tariffs on Chinese modules since 2012, actually. So it's not like this is a brand new thing, but it certainly has the potential to drive costs a little bit higher, again, on solar systems, which happened the last time the tariffs hit Chinese modules.
Yeah, that's a great point. So just to bring some clarity to that, this is the tariffs were put into place into 2012. And as a result of the tariffs, many of these manufacturers moved manufacturing outside of China to some of these neighboring countries to try and potentially circumvent the tariffs. And then the Commerce Department decided to investigate to see if, in fact, they have substantial investment to confirm that they're actually producing and opening up a business in those countries, or are they just trying to circumvent the tariffs? Right. And that's what these preliminary findings are all about, that, yes, in fact, some of these companies are, in fact, circumventing them.
Yeah. And I think what's going to happen, Warren, is if these companies, and there's a significant number of companies that are named, that if they all get hit with a tariff, it's going to push even the non-tariff modules up because the market's going to pressure it upward. I mean, the companies that Paradise is currently using are not affected by this, but indirectly they will be probably.
Yeah. It's hard not to think of the juxtaposition or the irony of these potential tariffs in the face of the administration's green energy push and the Inflation Reduction Act and this desire for much more green energy. But at the same time, the squeeze on tariffs, the demand here is going to be excessive. And are these tariffs going to really impact that demand?
Yeah, and the article in Solar Power World actually mentioned, I think it said 82% of the solar modules are being imported from that area. So yeah. When you look at, they're talking about solar installs, quadrupling in the next few years, and the supply going away. That's a gigantic headache.
Yeah, and the reality is, even though they have 2 years here to comply, it takes much longer than 2 years to build manufacturing and bring that home to a level where it can produce the solar panels that we need.
And we're seeing some accelerated efforts there to build out. I mean, one of our key suppliers is Hanwha. Yeah. And they're significantly increasing production in the U.S.
Yeah.
Now, they're not going to be affected by the tariff directly, but still a lot more domestic manufacturing coming.
Which is great, which is
It
great.
is.
Yeah, it really is. Great. Well, we'll keep an eye on this, and we'll probably talk more between now and May 23rd when the final determination is made. But let's switch gears for a second, Dale, and let's talk about the Treasury Department's announcement of the preliminary guidelines for the Inflation Reduction Act, specifically as it relates to the apprenticeship program and the prevailing wage. So just for context for everybody, in the Inflation Reduction Act, for systems that are over 1 megawatt AC are required to meet these requirements of both apprenticeship and prevailing wage in order to qualify for the full 30% ITC. And there's been a lack of clarity or understanding on what exactly these requirements were. And last week, well, November 29th, the U.S. Department of Treasury put out their preliminary guidelines, which got posted in the Federal Register the following day on December 1st. And there's a few interesting pieces to this. It's interesting how at the very top of their guidance, they put a note that the 60-day clock has started. Talk to us a little bit about that, Dale.
Yeah, so there's a 60-day window that they allowed in the bill to basically waive these requirements. And so the question was, and they also stated that the clock would start ticking on those 60 days when they issued their initial guidance. And it should be noted, this is the initial guidance, not necessarily the final. There could be some tweaks probably along the way, but the initial guidance has been issued. So that clock started ticking. And when that expires, when that 60-day window closes, then the ITC will drop to a 6% base. That's where it's going to start, is at 6. And then there's a 24-point add-on for these two requirements. And as I understand it, meeting one of the requirements won't get you half of the 24. You either get all of the 24 or you get none of it. And you're going to have to be paying prevailing wage. And you're going to also have to have an apprenticeship program of some sort involved. And there's statistics. I mean, there's some numbers around that. I can share that if it's of interest to you.
Okay, great. So we'll get to that in just a second. Let's talk about, it looks like they snuck in also a safe harbor provision and defined the beginning of construction again, as they have with traditional rules, or either a 5% rule. So how's that going to play out?
Yeah, so we went through this, Warren. Basically, it's very similar to how the ITC was stepping down in the past. So when it went from 30 to 26, there was a safe harbor and a beginning of construction requirement. And then when it was going to go from 26 to 22, that same thing was coming into play. And then they extended it at 26. But at the end of the day, this new provision is almost identical, from what I understand, in that there are two ways to get that waiver inside those 60 days. And the one is to begin construction. And that one, or what they call the physical test for beginning construction. And the physical test requires that you actually are doing something on the job site. A development of the project doesn't count. Permitting doesn't count. There's a lot of back office things that don't count towards what they consider the physical test for beginning construction. The other test for beginning construction is the 5% safe harbor. And in that situation, you have to pay 5% of the cost. The customer has to pay 5% of the costs, and we have to legitimize those costs. In other words, we have to pass that on. We either have to do the development, we have to buy hardware of some sort, get it to the job site, modules, inverters, whatever it would take to meet 5%. So that option's there, and I think a lot of people are going to use it for systems that are in development already.
Correct. And this is almost identical to how the ITC was safe harbored over the last several years, as it was scheduled to step down prior to the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act.
Yeah, we've had a lot of experience with it here at Paradise. I mean, I think the one year we were up around 50, 60 projects, if I recall correctly, that we safe harbored. And it's certainly a viable option to reduce your cost on an install.
Great. All right, so let's jump into these two requirements a little deeper. Let's start off with the prevailing wage. Mm-hmm. And so these, again, only for projects that are over 1 megawatt on the AC side, that's the inverter output, will be required to pay prevailing wage. Are there any guidelines that come out and define, or what there are in areas where there may not be a prevailing wage
Yeah, well, there's,
notification?
in the solar industry, Warren, prevailing wage has not been a major player on a lot of
Yeah,
projects, unless you're working on a government site. Then it is, a school or something like that. But for many installers, even like ourselves, we've not done a lot of prevailing wage work. Prevailing wage rates can be there's two places where they come from. The one is at the state level, and the one is at the federal level. So my understanding of this is because it's a federal tax credit, it will be the federal level that will determine it, which is the Davis-Bacon Act.
sure.
So those rates can be different than a state rate would be. But basically what you have to do is, based on the location of the project and the skill sets that are required for that job, there are predetermined wage rates. And they are available. You can get them online. There's actually a website, I think it's www.sam.gov, where you can actually put in states and locations and find the rates for that area. And if they don't have them, then you have to request them.
Great. And now, from a record keeping perspective, the onus is going to fall on the taxpayer. Is that what I'm understanding?
That's some fascinating wording, Warren. It appears that they're going to hold the taxpayer responsible to make sure these requirements are met. And I'm going to guess that the majority of taxpayers, unless it's a large utility company or something like that that's installing a system, many of them probably won't know very much about this. So we'll see how that plays out. But yeah.
And the prevailing wage is a requirement not only on the installer of the solar, but any of their subcontractors or anybody who's hired to do work on their project.
Yes.
Yep.
Yes. It would be any labor on that job site. Doesn't matter who's doing it.
Yep.
Now it doesn't apply. I mean, even like travel, it doesn't apply to travel. It doesn't apply to back office. It's when you're on the job site.
Great. All right, so now let's talk about the apprenticeship program requirements. In some areas of the country, there are limited access to these programs. Some areas are more saturated and they're readily available. And then some companies have apprenticeship programs of their own that are internal. What do those requirements look like?
Yeah, so this is new turf for us. A lot of unions have these, and I would say a lot of solar EPCs are not unionized. So this is probably going to be new territory for many of us. I know for us personally, we've had a training program for years, but it's not been registered with the government. We're actually working on that now to get our program registered. But there is requirements there for this apprentice, and there are ratios like journeyman to apprentice ratios that you have to meet. And there's also a requirement for how much of the labor on a job site is performed by apprentices. So for jobs starting after January 1, 2023, I think it's 12.5%. And after 1/1/2024, it's 15%. So you'd have to make sure that all the labor on that job site is at that ratio. Say 2023, 12.5% of the labor hours would be apprentices that would be doing, and they would have to be in the program, and the program would have to be registered.
And does that continue to step up year after year, or is it just
it stops at 15 as far as I know?
Okay.
Yeah, and that's probably realistic, because you can't just keep stepping it up, because any employer is not going to have all apprentices working. You're going to start to have experienced people. Apprenticeship programs typically last 6 years. So, and actually, there's that also comes into the prevailing wage numbers, because apprentices are paid a percentage of the prevailing wage rate, and it's based on how long they've been an apprentice. So it's going to be 20, 30, 40, 50, 60%. And then once they're 6 years through the apprentice program, then it's 100% prevailing wage.
Yeah. So it seems like there's going to be a trickle down effect, even though the record keeping requirements, both for wages and apprenticeship, are on the onus of the taxpayer. The reality is that any reputable installer is going to need to be able to provide these to their buyers.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the EPCs like ourselves, the installation companies, we're going to have to be able to do that and provide it to the taxpayer.
Yeah. So these are exciting times. There's a lot of interesting information to keep a tab on and watch how the industry evolves. Any final thoughts on either the anti-dumping tariffs and what impact that would have on us as a company, or the announcement of the preliminary guidelines here?
Well, I think the overriding thought, Warren, is that it's going to increase costs. So there's some new incentives. We've got some new higher percentages on the tax credit if we can qualify for them. Those are good things, but it's also going to raise our costs. I mean, just the admin costs associated with prevailing wage and apprenticeship programs add costs that we don't currently have. So assume the costs are going higher, and the tax credits hopefully go higher and offset some of this, but it is going to be a challenge for all of our companies in the solar industry to adapt.
Very interesting. The Inflation Reduction Act and the prevailing wage as well. A little bit of irony there for that.
Yeah.
Yeah,
and actually, I'll just add this. We did take a look at some of the prevailing wage information. It's going to vary geographically. So, if you're installing a system in a city with a high prevailing wage set, it could be very different from installing in a rural area, even in the same state. It's going to vary by county, by location, and those variations are pretty significant based on what we've seen. So that's going to be the change for us, because we've typically paid the same wage rates to our employees no matter where they work.
Sure. That is interesting. And one thing not to be, we didn't really dig into too deeply here, are the add-ons for the energy communities, or the 10% for energy communities, or
Right.
the low-income areas, etc. In order for systems that are over 1 megawatt AC, they first have to still, just to get to the 30, they can't get the add-ons if they don't get to the 30%. Is that correct?
That, Warren, I don't know the answer to that. My hunch would be no, they could probably still get them.
Okay.
I'm not aware that there's a requirement that you meet the prevailing wage and the apprenticeship program, for instance, to get a domestic content add-on. I'm not aware of that. There may be, but I haven't found that.
Okay.
So if anybody knows, they can let us know.
Yes, if you are aware, post a comment. We would love to hear about it.
Sure.
Super. Well, Dale, thank you so much for your time. We appreciate it, and we'll talk to you on the next video. And if anybody would like to read either of the two articles that we referenced here, either from the United States Treasury on the guidelines, or the Commerce Department, we'll have links to those in the video descriptions below. Thank you for watching.